Hey, good morning, everybody. Welcome to 2024. We're 3 minutes late, but we're not opinions short. Why would we be late, you wonder, in the new year, the first broadcast of the new year? Tech issues. And that's right, we're on brand. 2024 promises to be a year filled with even more issues because I've figured out how to hook this thing up to the Rodecaster, and that means I can do sound effects. Thank you. I'd like to thank the Academy. I'd like to thank my mother. I'd like to thank the man who claimed to be my father and the obstetrician for the hard work in bringing me birth. All right. Anyhow, listen, 2024, let's get to it. Welcome back to Law and Legitimacy. We had a great holiday break, Mike and I. We spent some time trying to figure out where we're headed with this platform, and let's find out if we can get there. We want to talk today, just briefly, give you some landmarks about where we're headed for this year and what we'll be watching. And we're obviously interested in your contributions, insight, and thoughts on where we should be heading and on the contour of where we are. But first, Happy New Year, Mike.
Happy New Year.
So was Santa good to you all?
Santa was great over here.
Oh, that's great. Good. Well, we had a great time. We were up in Vermont. I'm still here. I'll be leaving it today, in fact, heading back to Connecticut where there is no snow. And I can't believe that people can live in a world without snow and be content. In any case, the trends to watch in 2025, they're a little bit different, obviously, than what we 2024. Excuse me, I forgot the year that we have to endure. Obviously, the election. The election is going to be fundamentally different than any other election, at least since the Civil War, in the sense that there will be ongoing legal challenges to the legitimacy of the entire enterprise. At the close of the year, we had Maine's Secretary of State claim that Donald Trump could not be on the Maine ballots. Colorado's Supreme Court had ruled that Trump should be excluded, but that ruling has been stayed pending a petition for certiorari before the United States Supreme Court. In as many as 16, or is it 23, I can't recall, other states, there are challenges to Trump's petition on the ballot. The Colorado Supreme Court reversed a trial court decision. And so the law is all over the map. And soon the United States Supreme Court will be presented with the meaning of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment and how to implement it in our time. And what will be interesting about that for the world will obviously be the court's role in this essential political question: who is eligible to sit on the and to run for president, to be on the ballot in a given jurisdiction. But it will hold front and center issues of constitutional interpretation, which is what we'll focus on here. In other words, how do judges read the Constitution? How should they read it? Is there a right method? As the year ended, I was listening to Cass Sunstein's book on constitutional interpretation. It's so good, I've now ordered a hard copy of it to read it, in part so I can better understand it, in part so I can discuss it with you. The Constitution doesn't come with an instruction manual on how to read it. How we read it are choices that we bring to the document. There'll be an interesting bit of whipsaw effect among readers of constitutional texts early in 2024 as the court copes with whether Donald Trump is eligible to be on ballots because he engaged in or aided comfort and support to those engaged in insurrection. That's what Section 3 of the 14th Amendment says. A person who has done that cannot be on the ballot. And what we'll see is that people will say, well, that's what the text of the Constitution says. The textualists will claim that there's no limitation of that doctrine to the post-Civil War era, that as a Civil War amendment in the reformulation of the Constitution, the second founding, as Eric Foner calls it, this is now the fundamental law of the land, every bit as fundamental as a First Amendment right to freedom of speech. But how to implement it will become the million-dollar question. And Maine's decision really screams out for review. I didn't realize it, but Sheena, what's her last name? Do you recall, Mike?
Bellows.
Sheena Bellows isn't even a lawyer. Sheena is a Middlebury College graduate given to far-left political views who's known to opine on such things as, well, the Electoral College is a bastion of white supremacy. And so what's a non-lawyer doing in a non-judicial proceeding declaring that a presidential candidate should not be on the ballot? Open question. So expect plenty of fireworks in that decision or in arguments about that. I expect the Supreme Court will conclude that better procedures need to be engaged in order to reach a decision that Trump is disqualified than Maine endured. And then it'll turn to the Colorado case where there was actual evidence. Evidence was taken for 5 days. And will it conclude that the findings there are sufficient to show that Trump engaged in insurrection? Or will the courts conclude that that was essentially a political question resolved, if not conclusively, for criminal purposes by the House impeachment, by the congressional impeachment of Donald Trump, the second impeachment? Will it conclude that that impeachment was the legal proceeding, and that impeachment proceeding concluded there was no insurrection, or at least it didn't vote to impeach Trump on grounds that he engaged in insurrection, and therefore, as a matter of law, the issue's been decided? Tough issue, superimposed on all the passions the politics of 2024 will impose. It's enough to make my head explode just even thinking about it. So let's, we don't even know, is it going to be Trump versus Biden? Are other candidates going to emerge? Is Robert Kennedy really trying to throw the election of the president into the House? Something that Laura Loomer has publicly speculated about, and that Kennedy's foundation has said, yeah, that is their goal. I mean, let's stay tuned. 2024 is going to be as consequential an election as we've had in recent history. And I know it's said every 4 years, this is the most important election that we'll ever have, but something tells me this one just might be it. And in terms of the culture wars, I think we've talked before about pluralism. We've talked before about visions of the good life and how a society is defined in part by its collective vision of the good. We seem to have lost sight of that now, and events in the Middle East and the deposing of the president of Harvard, Claudine Gay, as a result of her incoherent testimony before Congress about when it's okay to be anti-Semitic and when it's not. This suggests that pluralism is feeding on itself now, and we've finally entered the vacuum stage of this vacuous doctrine. Pluralism, as opposed to monism, was the view that there could be many different versions of the good life. But they were all aimed at some implicit understanding that there was such a thing as a good life, and that it could have recognizable contours by people within a larger community. Are we past that point now? Are we now at a point where when people protest in support of Hamas in the Middle East, what they're saying is it's okay to engage in savagery, it's okay to mutilate a woman's breast and feed them to her as you kill her, it's okay to behead a child, it's okay to take a child's head, stuff it in your flak jacket, hoping that you'll survive to get home and show this trophy. It's okay to rape old women. It's okay to hold civilians hostage, because after all, this is how you obtain justice. Is that really what we've come down to? Let's focus on that. I think that sucking sound you hear this morning, that's Western civilization swirling a drain. Can we pull it out before it gets flushed out entirely? Let's find out. Artificial intelligence is a third trend that ended ominously as the year ended. There was lots of discussion about superintelligence and whether OpenAI and Sam Altman's crew had let a genie out of the bottle. Even Elon Musk was saying in the next couple of years we may get superintelligence. What's going on in the AI space? Are we yielding something fundamentally human to machines that we don't fully understand? How much of our lives do we retain control of? How autonomous are we any longer when the choices that we make are increasingly sculpted by machines the choices that we're free to make are increasingly sculpted by machines whose technology we scarcely understand? Neural networks, quantum computing, they introduce an element of chance and circumstance into artificial intelligence, and we are somehow habituated to believe what artificial intelligence produces. Last year we learned in the legal context, to our astonishment, that some lawyers and their clients, including, no surprise, Michael Cohen, Donald Trump's former lawyer, were using AI to generate legal research. And some of that legal research sounded pretty convincing until you tried to read the cases and found out the cases didn't exist, but they looked good. They were correct in form. And people who were uninformed could take those and say, well, this is what the law says. you kind of wonder at some point about the world that AI is creating for us. Are we seeing a sense of reality? Is there a sense of reality that we can perceive via common sense, via common understandings that are unmediated by social medias and AI, or is all of reality constructed? You know, there used to be discussions among sociologists about the social construction of knowledge. Now we've got the technological construction of society. And it's no longer the sociology of knowledge, it's the technology of knowledge. And are we becoming increasingly widgets in a world we don't understand? And what are you going to do about it if we are? We'll be focusing on that. Immigration remains an explosive story. And as the year ended, I don't know about you, Mike, but I found myself even more confused about it all than I had been. Increasingly, you hear stories about migrants coming to the United States with prepaid credit cards with $5,000 spending limits, that at the border or shortly thereafter, they're given prepaid tickets with destinations to one location or another in the United States. Who's organizing this? Who's paying for it? Is it even true? You know, we hear a lot of people talking about the immigration crisis as an invasion, noting that many of the migrants crossing our borders are men. They're not families. They're men of military age. Are they coming as a beachhead to provide for their family, or are they coming as a beachhead for something more sinister? As the new year dawned, you know, I always am apprehensive and wonder what sort of new terroristic activity will take place. I expected more at the first of the year and was relieved that it didn't happen. So one of the framing questions for the immigration debate is, you know, to what degree is this just the natural movement of people, mediated, helped along by non-governmental organizations seeking to ease the plight of those moving from one location in the world to another in search of a better life, as opposed to something more organized and orchestrated, a desire to undermine the way of life that we cherish in this country, perhaps for political ends and goals. Don't know the answer to that. Can't even get questions being asked in many contexts. And then there's our classic, and Mike's and my preeminent preoccupation, and that is freedom of speech. You know, will we have substantive limits on speech? And this ties all new substantive limits on speech endorsed by the courts, and this ties all five of these themes together. Because, you know, I don't know about you, Mike, but I keep seeing at year's end and now year's beginning a lot of chest thumping about authoritarianism. You know, Donald Trump is an authoritarian. I'm reading Rachel Maddow's new book called Prequel. You know, trying to understand why the left is so persuaded that Donald Trump is the authoritarian threat they believe he is, because in my view, it's the left that is the authoritarian threat. You know, in what do I mean by authoritarian? That imposition of a vision of the good life imposed from the top down. And you know, there are deeper currents that suggest that maybe authoritarianism is a good idea. And what do I mean by that? Well, clearly there is a reality out there. There's a physical reality. When you're sick, you don't go to a witch doctor. You go to a physician, I think. I mean, most of us go to physicians. If you go to a witch doctor, give me your number. I've got these aches and pains my real doctor can't resolve. But you go to a physician, and the physician has been trained, according to the natural sciences, to use his or her judgment in accord with known principles and precepts that have been researched, tried, tested, and shown to be reliable in clinical studies and through the use and comparison of treatment protocols by physicians worldwide. That is authoritative. And you go there because you think they know. Similarly, you know, economists can speak with some level of authority about the behavior of large groups of people under conditions of scarcity, how goods and services are distributed in light of marginal utility functions of those individuals on a microeconomic level, and how the decisions of government or larger institutions on a macroeconomic level, by manipulating spending or the money supply, you can choose your side of that debate, can influence behavior. Clearly, they're talking about something that's real. Should we yield to them the ability to make decisions about what's good for the broader public in general? You hear discussions about the need to combat disinformation or misinformation. Is it too easy to grab the airwaves these days and say anything you like, even if it's untrue, when you've got impressionable listeners? Maybe, because it may be that there are people who knowingly profit from untruths. who misstate things in order to make a buck. But if we're going to regulate them and keep them from the airwaves, who's going to determine what's reliable enough for the airwaves? And I think there's an emerging consensus in the legal world that we need to have some sort of authority like that. And is that authoritarian? And so, are we going to say that in the name of science, in the name of in the name of the broader social good, as told to us by economists, in the name of information, as told to us by someone, I hope it's not the New York Times, that there are authorities that are worth respecting, and that there should be laws that implement respect and enforce respect for those norms and punish departures from those norms? I think this is a debate you're going to see a lot of in 2024, especially as we enter into the campaign season, and political speech, which has always been inflammatory in this country, now mobilized and amplified by social media, may or may not create a lot of social dis-ease in the oncoming election year. I begin to see, as the 2024 election season begins, and let's face it, next week, January 15th, the Iowa caucuses will make their selections. As this season begins, it'll culminate in an election. It'll culminate in the transfer of power 1 year from now, in January of 2025. And of course, you have to think about January of 2021, and we're still litigating and prosecuting cases that arose in on January 6, 2021, seeking long prison sentences for people who appeared at the Capitol, engaged in a riot, and sought, in many instances, to delay the counting of electoral votes that day. Should they, the extent of the government's decision to prosecute these people is an intention to send a message: don't do this again. Don't interfere with another election. But it's had a chilling effect on public participation in public events. Note and it's had a chilling effect as directed by the United States government. I don't know if you saw over the weekend, Ray Epps has been offered a plea deal in the January 6th context. Ray Epps was the individual in the red cap and a sporting jacket who many people thought was a confidential human source, a government informant urging people on to protest. He's been offered a plea deal, and the government has recommended under the plea deal to the court that he be given a 6-month sentence of incarceration. Why? Because he, cooperated with the government thereafter, and he adopted the government's narrative. There's something chilling. There's something wrong with that. Guys like Joe Biggs, who I represented, got 17 years because they believed a narrative about the election. They acted on it. They thought the election had been stolen. They wanted to stop it. Ray Epps apparently changed his tune immediately after his arrest and told prosecutors what they wanted to hear. Joe Biggs is a terrorist because he didn't agree with prosecutors. Ray Epps is a misguided individual who's seen the truth, and we're going to give him a slap on the wrist, comparatively speaking, because he agrees with us. Buried in this debate, buried in the disparate treatment of Biggs and Epps, are visions of what counts as reality, of what is authoritative, what can be believed. And there's these are decisions that are made by policymakers, and they're decisions that have practical consequences, I think, for you and for me going forward. So the top 5 things or events that we'll be talking about this year, I think, are obviously the election, attempts to curtail the franchise ab initio at the beginning, before it even begins, by keeping Trump off the ballot. We'll be watching to see what new candidates emerge in 2024, because I suspect there are candidates as yet undeclared whose names will soon become known, and the election could go wide open. We'll be watching the culture wars, Claudine Gay stepping down as president of Harvard. I think she wrote the letter over the weekend. She remains on the faculty, earning a salary of around $900,000 a year. Mike, we should have gone into academics, to spew half-truths and to engage in plagiaristic production of the 11 or so scholarly articles that define her corpus. AI will wonder about the nature of reality and what we're being shown, and whether whether there is a new boss, and whether there will be the emergence of superintelligence this year, and if so, whether this will be the beginning or the end of the the human project. Immigration, again, I'll be hawking the book Camp of the Saints by Jean Raspail. Somehow this book needs to be brought back into publication, and people need to understand that Raspail's parable was not a racist rant against the third world, but was a sober reflection on what it takes to keep and maintain a community. And then obviously the ongoing development of cases on free speech. The easy target, the low-hanging fruit in this context is hate speech. But this debate, I think, is now emerging into a more subtle debate about the nature of disinformation and misinformation. And I suspect that we will see trends at both the federal Supreme Court, state Supreme Court levels, and federal regulatory levels, and certainly in our cultural institutions, to have regulated speech. There'll be there is an emerging norm of civility that is not self-enforcing in the absence of a broader commitment to cultural uniformity. And so in the absence of an agreement, there will be a compelled requirement that people adhere to these cultural norms, and who decides that will be a crucial issue. So, Mike, are you even there this morning? I think that was like a 20-minute rant where I'm just kind of blowing, and I'm watching your eyes as I see you there, and I think you stayed awake. I hope our listeners did.
I'm monitoring the chat, but I've got an echo. You can't hear it, but everybody else can.
Okay. Well, sorry about the echo. That means that you're twice as insightful, right? We promised to resolve the tech issues, going forward this year. And I'm hoping that this has something to do with my being up in Vermont. Now I had the echoes there as well.
Well, but I'm still here. I'll try to speak. Talk about what we're.
So in terms of new developments with Law and Legitimacy, Mike and I spent some time last week talking about how to organize the content here. And we're going to have a newsletter that will have some written content. It'll link to a blog page of mine that I had begun years ago, and the data will migrate over to Mike. And we're going to offer written supplements to the things that we talk about here. Mike and I will both author those. You can sign up for them, give us your email, and we'll send you the email. This will give us a way to better determine who's listening, what they want, and control. We'll be data mining ourselves because we're no better than big tech. Well, actually, I think as this broadcast demonstrates, Mike and I are low tech. We are low tech information purveyors. We're having troubles with echoes, but we'll have that as well. You'll see features, what we're reading, for example, on a new web page, and opportunities for you to learn about books that may be of interest to you, that are of interest to us, and we think ought to be of interest to you. We'll have a new look on some of these pages. Mike has spent a lot of time developing the graphic. Our hope going forward this year is to make good on the commitment to be a reasonable response to the chaos in the world around you. We spent a lot of time last week, Mike and I, talking about what we see working and not working in the podcast world. And we've made a decision to avoid what we'll call the Bongino complex. Hi, you gotta listen to us today, because right now there's a pivotal trend that if you listen to me, I'll tell you the answer. And once you have the answer, you'll be armed and ready to go to war with those globalists, because they're stinking rotten creeps. And if you spend $29.95 on my stinking rotten creep cream, you can be immune from the kind of crap that the globalists are trying. Nobody wants to listen to that. Well, actually, that's not true. Plenty of people want to listen to that, but Mike and I don't want to, and we don't want to purvey it. So our objective is to remain neutral, calm, and to try to provide you with a legal analysis of events as they occur. We'll also unfold something that we promised last year and never fully delivered on, and that is a course on constitutional law. where we'll go through a constitutional law textbook. We're not going to do it on the general podcast, Law and Legitimacy. It'll be on our web page, and you'll be able to get access to it. But one of the things we want to empower you to do is to understand the world and events as they are occurring around you through the lens of reasoned legal discourse. Is that the only discourse there is? No, but it's one that Mike and I know. And the first and fundamental problem with constitutional law is, well, what is it? You know, the Constitution is not a self-defining instrument. The Fourth Amendment's prohibition against unreasonable searches and seizures sounds great until you have to stick 5 people in a room to agree about what reasonable means and under what circumstances. And what you'll learn, and what you've probably learned listening to this, is that the law is, if not a game, it's a language game. As Ludwig Wittgenstein might say, there are conventions, there are norms, there are ways that lawyers of reasonable skill and training agree about how to interpret the Constitution. Those may or may not reflect the public's understanding of what the Constitution is or what it should mean. And when the gulf between the law and a general population, the law is applied and a general population is big enough, there's a legitimation crisis. People don't understand how it is that goods and services or rights are being given, taken away, or abridged. And so we're going to be asking fundamental questions in this class about whether the Constitution serves the purposes of liberty or the good life in the United States any longer, whether it can and whether it should. There's a fun word, bibliolatry, that is the adoration of books, the making of books into a fetish. Are we bibliolaters with respect to the Constitution? Do we import too much onto it and say that it's going to solve all of our problems? Was it always meant to be a limited tool set to resolve limited problems for limited means? We don't necessarily have the answer to that question. We think it's enough to pose it. And we think it's enough to pose it by contrast to looking what happened to American fundamentalism, American Christianity in the 19th and 20th century. There was a fundamentalist movement that took the Protestant Reformation's promise that you could eliminate the Catholic Church, that individual believers could have direct access to God, and that Scripture alone was necessary. Sola scriptura in the Latin. So the Scripture alone would give you insight into the divine and a relationship with the divine. And the result was that some people took the Bible, and this will sound odd to some people, perhaps too seriously. Matthew Arnold and others would write about bibliolaters. The Bible doesn't necessarily have answers to every question that every person can ask. And it doesn't have answers that every reasonable person will necessarily accept. It is a window into a broader world, a world defined by a loving God communicating through grace with individual human beings who are open to grace. And it tells the story of redemption and of that God's creation of a world and commitment to that world. Do we serve him by making an idol of the book about him? That's bibliolatry. Do we serve the purposes of the founders by making an idol of the document that was meant to be a roadmap for how we govern ourselves going forward? That's constitutional bibliolatry. So one of the things that Mike and I will try to do in the course of this year is engage a broader sense of civic literacy. Why would we have a constitution? Why would a world created in the image of God need communication from that God to individuals? What freedom do we have as individuals within respected legal interpretive canons have to reasonably disagree about the meaning of constitutional texts? What freedom do we have as individual believers or as individual people responding to the calls of grace as we discern it in our life to see different meanings in the written word of God, that is the Bible? Important questions. We think you're not going to get the sort of answers to those questions or even have those questions posed in the way we pose them anywhere else online. And our promise to you this year is to try to be a thoughtful and insightful response to the chaos around you in terms of the broader critical instruments that have made Western civilization a commitment to the Judeo-Christian tradition, and a commitment to constitutional text, and a commitment to a Western cultural tradition that gave birth to both the Judeo-Christian tradition and the Western constitutional tradition. You know, that's the goal. Let's see how well we do. You showed up this morning. We had a little bit of a late start because of tech issues, and Mike has left me on my own, all alone here because of his tech issues with respect to the Echo, and you've endured this first half an hour. Listen up, check us out online, come back tomorrow morning. We will be back almost every day of the week from 8 to 8:30, 5 days a week. Once a month at a minimum, we're going to have long form interviews with people. Usually those will take place on a Sunday, where we'll talk for an hour or two to someone who really interests us because of the critical perspective that they bring to bear on the world, and we want to share them with you. If you're listening, Pete Atkinson, expect a phone call because we've identified you as person number one. We want to hear more about what you're up to as you bring the saints to life in a world rife with sin. So welcome back, everybody, to Law and Legitimacy. You know where to find us. Give us 5 stars. Give us a like. Sign up for our newsletter. Spread the word. We're back, and we're really looking forward to 2024. It's a terrifying sort of year because there are so many loose ends in the world right now. I often wonder whether we can tie them up in a way that will satisfy us all. All I can promise you here throughout 2024 is our best effort to be reasonable, to be respectful, to be kind, to be thoughtful, and when necessary, to be scornful of that which is to be scorned. The world is filled with love and grace, and we're grateful for your participation in our worlds. At Spread the Word, we'd like to participate in yours and others as well. See you tomorrow.